Hey there, this is part 2 of the psycholinguistic impairment videos. It was going to be just one, but I got to about 30 minutes doing auditory comprehension and spoken expression and realised your brain was probably going to go on strike, and if I continued, you'd probably watch it at double speed instead of pausing. So split it up into two. So today we are following this side of the model here, which is reading and writing. Two quick notes before we begin. One is about terminology. So in literature and in clinical practice, alexia and dyslexia are used interchangeably. So they mean essentially the same thing. In technical terms, alexia means inability to read and dyslexia means difficulty reading. That's not a meaningful distinction when it comes to aphasia and acquired language disorders, so they are used interchangeably. Some people do prefer alexia just to distinguish acquired impairments of reading from sort of developmental impairments of reading, developmental dyslexia. Same goes for dysgraphia and agraphia for impairments of writing and spelling. Note number 2 is just some of the labels. So a lot of these presentations of different impairments do have specific names. Personally, I haven't seen those names used a lot in clinical practice, at least not in Australia. It's more important to be able to profile the strengths and weaknesses of a particular person than to find the right label. All right, on we go. First up is visual orthographic analysis. Now, this is another one of those processes where there's a lot more going on than we are going to dive into. There are multiple layers and we probably don't even understand them all. But put simply, we know that it is recognizing each letter regardless of the font or the case, capital or lowercase, or the size, etc. It's also encoding what position or the order of the letters in a word, and it's binding those letters to the words and probably has a buffer there that it's storing in it as well. So it can take messy handwriting and convert that into letters in a particular order and pass those along for further processing. Now, issues at this level are called peripheral alexias, and there are multiple. We'll just touch on a few rather than going into detail. They're peripheral because it's closer to the visual analysis than the actual sort of language processing. Similarly to how the auditory phonological analysis is close to the hearing side of the processing pipeline. One thing that can go wrong, of course, is that letters might not be recognized or might be sequenced incorrectly. So a word such as tarp might be incorrectly processed as trap. You can also get what's called neglect dyslexia, which is where only one half of a word, of any given word, is processed correctly. So they would look at a word like tyrant, but the second half of that word is not being processed. Their brain, it's not that they're ignoring it or that they have any blindness, it's that they're just not processing that half. So although I've blurred it here, that's not strictly accurate. So they'll see a word like this, and they might just jump to the nearest likely candidate. Or if they're simply not recognizing letters, a word chimera might be assumed to be camera. You notice that these errors are visually similar, not necessarily semantically or phonologically similar, although because they share letters, they do tend to be phonologically similar. If this process is very slow, you might see letter by letter reading where each letter has to be processed, often out loud. So they might see this and say J, E, W. They also might not correctly be retrieving each letter one by one, despite the time that it takes. Although this can sometimes, if they're naming it out loud, this can sometimes be because they're choosing the incorrect entry in the phonological output lexicon for the letter, even though they might have correctly recognized it. So a little bit difficult to tell. Difficulty with visual orthographic analysis has a lot of downstream effects, so they can't accurately recognize, understand, and read aloud a word. They can't read aloud words that they recognize but don't understand. They can't sound out words correctly because they can't see the letters properly, and they can't copy them out because they're not correctly understanding the letters. So any task related to reading will be affected. For this one, just as with the auditory phonological analysis on the other side, you do need to look out for the co-occurrence of a few things. General visual impairments. There's also hemianopia, where due to a stroke, one side of the visual field is actually missing. There is also neglect, left side or right side neglect, either one. And this is different from the neglect dyslexia we talked about before. That specifically applies to processing words, whereas this is their general vision. Not that they can't see it, it's not a blindness, it's just that even though the visual signal is landing in the brain, it's not being further processed. So you do have to rule these out before you can assume that it's orthographic analysis going wrong. Next is the orthographic input lexicon, and this should recognize the sequence of letters passed to it and answer the question, have I read this word before? Impairment at this level impacts understanding written words or just reading words aloud that someone does not understand. You might see this being overactive where they're saying, yes, I recognize these words when they may not. They may just be making errors, mistaking one word for another, rather than a paraphasic error, that's a paralexic error, a paralexia. Or it might be underactive. I don't know that word, or taking a long time to recognize the word and having to read it lots of times. Now, there is an alternative. There is a way of rerouting this. You can use this pathway here, orthographic to phonological conversion, to read letter by letter, just as you would do if it was an new unknown word. And this is really common. It happens naturally. People don't recognize a word properly, and so they read it, they sound it out. This is called the sublexical route, because this is the lexicon where we store our words. Well, this is sublexical. We're bypassing the lexicon. By sounding the word out and then producing it verbally, you can then rely on comprehension down here to recognize words. So you're sort of using a different modality to help comprehension. There are a few consequences of this. Normally in unimpaired reading, known words are processed really quickly in the orthographic input lexicon or recognized. And although there actually technically is some processing here, it's a lot slower and therefore not really required. Unknown words or made up words, non-words, are processed by orthographic to phonological conversion. We use letters to sound rules to convert them. But if this is not working properly, known words are read through the orthographic phonological conversion, they are sounded out. And reading can be pretty good if this is intact, but it is slower. That sounding out process can slow us down. Imagine reading a text where you don't know 50% of the words, you're going to be pretty slow. But there is a problem with this. It's only partially successful. And I don't know if you can think about why it's partially successful. So the known words will be made up of regularly spelled words that follow the English rules like cloud and strange and gift. But then there are irregular or exception words in English and quite a few other languages where the spelling does not follow the pronunciation, it doesn't follow standard rules. So words like eighth and pint, they might be read as igth and pint. They're using the rules of English, but these are exception words, and the only way you know how to pronounce exception words is by storing those exceptions. Moving on, conversely, if the orthographic to phonological conversion is more impaired, you can't sound out words. You've lost the letter to sound correspondences. Now, how does this present? Well, known words will be relatively spared, and it doesn't matter if they're exceptions, irregular words or exception words in the way they're spelled because you know them. But for unknown words or non-words, there's very limited ability to solve what they say. And because they have to pass through the orthographic input lexicon, people reading these will often default to real words. So if you make up a word like glope, they will look at that and the orthographic input lexicon will find the nearest match and read it as globe. Now, this really only affects reading aloud. Comprehension is not really relevant because unknown words and non-words don't have meaning attached to them. However, they'll have a lot of difficulty learning new words without help. Now, to really demonstrate what I said at the start, which is that you'll see people with impairments distributed across areas, there is another alexia called deep alexia. And this is one in which the person can't sound out words, but they also can't recognize known words very well. And they can also make morphological errors where they add, past tense and different morphemes on and off. And they make visual errors. Visual errors being mistaking one word for another because it looks similar. And they also make semantic paralexias. In other words, they read one word as a different word that's semantically similar. For example, they might read this sentence like this. So the first word you would assume is not a recognized word. Because their ability to sound out letters for new words is impaired, they can't read that one. They might say through instead of tossed because it's a semantic error. The knife, another semantic error. Aside, they might mistake as inside, that's a visual error. In particular, it seems like symptoms can vary by just being a purely semantic impairment to also access to and access from the semantic system when reading aloud. That's reading impairments covered. We're going to cover spelling impairments, commonly called dysgraphia. Remember that spelling and reading are separate systems, so in some cases a person can write nearly perfectly and then be unable to read their own writing even moments after writing it, as soon as it leaves their short-term memory. Or sometimes they can read very well but then have poor fluency in spelling out words themselves. It feels like these systems are the same, but they're not. If someone wants to write a word that's in their head, the semantic system should retrieve it from the orthographic output lexicon. The output lexicon should say, yep, we got a word for that. Here it is. Here are the letters. If this is not working properly, they have difficulty accessing those stored words. So you might get paragraphias, which is where they write the incorrect word, or other errors. But just like with reading, there is a reroute available. You can sound out words by kind of saying them aloud or sort of saying them to yourself and converting the sounds into letters. I used an example in a previous video of the word glentham, which is an unknown word for most people. And you would take the g and then the l and then the e and then the n, etc., convert them using the rules of spelling into English letters. Again, in normal writing, known words are stored in the orthographic output lexicon, and unknown words or made-up words would be converted in this way using the rules of English. In the case of damage to the orthographic output lexicon, you can't access those known words, so they're all processed through letter to sound correspondence. Once again, regularly spelled words will be a lot easier to spell, but people will struggle with irregularly spelled or exception words. In reality, if a word is really high frequency and it's irregular, like though, they probably will be able to spell that or come close because they're probably partly retrieving it and partly using this. But in general, irregularly spelled words are going to be spelled incorrectly. In this case, they'd also struggle to choose between homophones like been, B-E-E-N, and B-E-A-N. They both follow the rules of English, but they don't know which one should apply to which word, because that is all stored here. Now, note that this alternative processing route requires the phonological output lexicon and the buffer. So we're rerouting in this direction and then coming across. And so in this video, we are assuming that only the orthographic output lexicon is impaired and these are intact. In reality, people might have impairments here as well, which could make this strategy more or less successful depending on an individual's presentation. What if we invert that and those rules actually break down? In this case, known words, whether they're regular or exceptions, are all stored in the orthographic input lexicon. And it's unknown words and non-words that would be really difficult for them to spell. They won't be able to sound them out. People will be able to access the stored spellings, or if not perfectly, then a lot better. They just can't work out new spellings of new words. And then in deep dysgraphia, you will see very impaired non-word spelling and some difficulty accessing the orthographic output lexicon with semantic paragraphias. So they might try to write a word like broom and they might come out with the word sweep. That's a semantic paragraphia. In an error like that, it's clear that the correct or nearly the correct concept has been activated with all its features in the semantic system. but the retrieval of the letters is incorrect. The same is true in typing, by the way. It's not just limited to handwriting, so the word might be mango and they type out pawpaw because it's pretty similar. The next step in normal spelling is that the orthographic output buffer holds the letter order for production so that you don't have to constantly keep retrieving it. In parallel to spoken output, if this is impaired, you might see additions of letters that you don't want, deletions of letters that should be there, substitutions of one letter for another, and transpositions of letters where they're switched around. Because you've got kind of what you want, but you're not holding them long enough to sequence them properly. Now, just like the phonological output buffer, there is a length effect with the orthographic output buffer. So the longer the word, the more likely these errors are because there is more to hold in the buffer. From there, we should see the spatial and visual information for letters retrieved. For example, Beijing goes from a series of abstract letters into actual visual concepts of what those letters should look like. Errors at this level, you might see something like this. They know the letters they want, but visually they're choosing things that are similar. Patients that I've had have described this level of impairment as though their hand is taking over, so they're wanting to write one thing and these different shapes come out. The difference between this level and the previous level, the orthographic output buffer, in this one with impairment, they find the letters getting scrambled in their mind, but here they're clearer about what they want and they can even spell them aloud, but they come out wrong, particularly with handwriting. There's actually not a lot of research on how this affects typing. Similarly, and it's a pretty advanced skill to distinguish between these, so don't stress too much. But this process should select the motor plan for each letter, and it should make a plan, something like this. But if this is impaired, the movements are incorrect. They've forgotten the motor movements. So you might retrieve the letters correctly, you might know the shapes that they should be, and then you have difficulty doing that. It's as if you've started all over again. The learned motor programs are damaged. It's no longer fluent or easy or a matter of just writing a B. You have to concentrate. So really, again, anything above this line is more in the domain of language and would be called aphasia. And this becomes a motor aspect and it's more of an apraxia. But it needs to be there in the model. This can be called apraxic agraphia. The person can, if it's just this level and nothing else, they can describe the letters, they can laboriously copy letters, but they kind of come out the wrong shape, particularly when it's spontaneous. You'll see substitution, you'll see incomplete letters, fusion of letters, non-existent letters. They're doing it very visually. There's no concept or plan for these letters to write them. So this is one case where typing can be a lot better because the different and much simpler motor plan of pushing a button compared to writing a G. Where is the impairment when someone repeatedly writes the wrong letters, even though they can say them aloud correctly? This would be the graphemic to graphic process. Because they have retrieved the right letters, they've sequenced them right as shown by the fact that they can say them out loud, but they're writing incorrect letters. It possibly could happen here, but you're more likely to see lines that don't really resemble letters correctly. Where is the impairment when someone attempts to write the word debt and writes it D-E-T-T? Well, what should happen is they think of this concept and go to retrieve the spelling for the word, and it should be stored here in the output lexicon. Therefore, it's probably here where the damage is. They've gone to retrieve that word and they're not able to retrieve it. It looks as though they've spelt that word phonetically, and that double T might suggest that they're trying to apply some rules of English. So they're probably using this route to sort of retrieve it from the output lexicon, the spoken output lexicon, say it to themselves and then convert that into letters. It's not impossible that this error is caused by sort of transposing the T across in the orthographic output buffer, although that's not that likely with a 4-letter word. And it is possible that they're sort of writing a T even though they're intending to write a B. I think this is the most likely candidate, but of course you can't really diagnose this with just a single word. You'd need to investigate further. What if someone is able to read common words, but they're unable to read unfamiliar words aloud? So they appear to read very fluently, and then they come across unfamiliar or non-words, and they're unable to read that aloud. Well, if you trace what they can do, they are recognizing letters, they're recognizing the words, and they're understanding them, we assume, but at least they're reading them aloud. So that pathway is relatively intact. Unfamiliar words normally go through here, so the problem must be with orthographic to phonological conversion, which is phonological dyslexia or alexia. Where is the impairment for someone who reads the written word crucial as crucible? This one's a trick question. There's a few possible answers. You'd want to ensure there's no visual problems going on first with their reading, but it could be within visual orthographic analysis. It could be a neglect dyslexia where they're only really processing the first few letters or the first left half of the word and then assuming the rest, or simply incorrectly identifying some of the letters. It could be an issue with the orthographic input lexicon where they're just retrieving the wrong entry, or perhaps their reading is intact. And it's actually a problem with the phonological output lexicon where they're selecting the wrong entry as they read it aloud. For this reason, you do need to be careful when you're assessing someone and they're reading aloud and you notice errors. It's a long pathway from the top right to the bottom left and lots of possible errors that you need to distinguish between. Where is the impairment when someone sounds out all words when reading aloud, making errors on irregularly spelled words? Well, again, if you trace what they can do, they're sounding out words. So the orthographic to phonological conversion is operating, but of course when it comes across an irregularly spelled word, an exception word, it doesn't know. It can't process that because that exception is stored in the orthographic input lexicon. Again, you'd want to ensure it's not a problem with the phonological output lexicon where they're making the errors, but if there's a real pattern that it's irregularly spelled words, you would conclude that it's the orthographic input lexicon. I hope that hasn't given you a headache. Just take your time with it, think carefully, remember the disclaimers at the start about how to apply this model. And thanks once again to Lindsay Nichols for reviewing the things I said here and making sure I don't make any errors. See you next time, the end.